winter in Melbourne has traditionally always been rose planting time. And one of the main reasons for that, the plants are dormant through winter, and it doesn't stress the plant as much to put it into the garden at this time of the year. So they come into the stores as what they call bare-rooted roses. You can also buy things like bare-rooted fruit trees, etc. at this time of the year. So essentially we get them in. The roses have been grown in the ground at a rose farm, and they go through and they dig them up in the winter time when they're dormant, and our supplier then pots them into pots. Some stores sell them in plastic bags. You might have seen them where they've got, say, sawdust around the root system or some sort of material that helps to keep the roots moist. And we used to sell them that way many years ago, but we find that the rose, if it sits in the bag for a long time, tends to dry out and the roots tend to desiccate, and when you come to plant them in the garden, they don't transplant very well. So we prefer to get them potted. The potting mix actually holds moisture around the root system. The plant doesn't get stressed at all. So the soil's there really just to hold the plant through the winter months. The rose doesn't start to grow until the weather warms up in spring. So they don't need any other fertiliser or anything at this time of the year other than just keeping them damp. That's the main thing. So I'll take one out of the pot now just to show you what the roots are going to be like, and then I'll explain how to pot them. So you'll see all the soil just falls away and you end up with a plant like that with hardly any roots on it. Some of the roots might be a little bit bigger. When they dig them out of the ground from the farm, the roots get chopped, and then when they come to pot the roses, they have to tidy the roots up and cut off any damaged roots on the plant, obviously to help the plant survive. So what do you do with this when you get it home and you want to plant it in the garden or you want to grow it in a pot? It's critical between the time that you do come to plant it and the time that it leaves the nursery that the plant doesn't dry out. Those roots have to stay damp all the time. Even though the plant's dormant, if the roots were to dry out, which as I mentioned sometimes can happen in those bags, then the whole plant can shrivel up and die. So it would happily stay in this pot until you're ready to plant it. If you don't want to plant it in the winter, you don't have to. You could leave it in the pot until, say, September even. So I'll talk about the aspect for roses. They all love sun, minimum daily sun, 5 to 6 hours. Some people plant them in too much shade and the rose will grow but you won't get any flowers. So you have to make sure that a northerly aspect or a westerly aspect is probably the best spot for roses, where they're going to get all that, nice sun particularly through the warmer months of the year. The soil has to be a reasonable sort of quality soil. Roses are fairly tolerant of heavier soils, not really waterlogged clay soils, but they will tolerate, heavier types if need be, providing the water drains away from the root system. At this time of the year, it's a good opportunity to improve the soil at planting time or prior to planting time. And there's various products you can get to add to the soil, to add organic matter to the soil. There are rose mixes which are either used as potting mixes or as soil conditioners. And it's got the consistency of a potting mix, but if you have got, say, a soil that might be a bit heavier and you need to improve it, then you can add those sort of products mixed through at planting time. Compost, just a general purpose compost is good for roses when you're putting them into the ground.
Would you also add compost later on in spring again as food?
You could, as on the top of the soil, that's fine. Or you could use just a general rose fertiliser, and I'd probably suggest adding rose food at that time in the springtime. In the winter it's not so critical because the plant's not going to use it. The compost is more dug through to encourage, improve the organic matter in the soil. So it's not that critical at this stage where you need to feed the rose. You may have heard of roses when they're bare rooted being planted on a mound. When you dig a hole, it's always been the traditional way to plant a bare rooted rose. This probably hasn't got a large enough root system as an example, but normally the roses have roots that sort of spread out like that. And if you build a bit of a mound at the base of the hole and then place those roots over that mound, it just tends to encourage the plant to spread the roots into the surrounding soil better, rather than just digging a hole and then just shoving it in. For some reason, and it's different from other plants, but it does help the roses establish better. Roses are all grafted, of course, and when you plant it, the graft has to be clear of the soil, so you can't bury it. Some of these are fairly low in the pot, but the plant has to sit above the soil level, otherwise you can get rotting and dieback. And it also helps to prevent suckering. Roses are very prone to suckering off the root system, so if you bury it too high, then they're more inclined to sucker because the plant wants to try and develop branches to get more sun on it. And the same point, it's worth avoiding doing any damage to the root system, because if you cut through the root system or break a root system when you plant the rose, that tends to stimulate suckering on the rose as well. So make sure it's planted at the right level, not too deep. You don't want to sit it up too high, because what will happen when it gets foliage on it, it's going to be too heavy and more inclined to blow over. So it's just getting the level right, and the soil level probably wants to come through where my fingers are there roughly, and that's enough to support the plant. Now it doesn't mean it won't get suckers if you do that, but it does help to deter them to a certain extent. When these are dug out of the farm, they're generally just lopped off. These would have had all branches, like a normal rose bush would grow, and in the farm they just go through and they chop the tops off them. And when the growers pop them, they don't do anything to the top of the plant. They might cut a few of the roots, but they don't prune it. So you'll notice on this one, for instance, there's a bud there, and that's probably cut too high above the bud. And you need to prune that back to just above the bud, and preferably on a slope away. The slope needs to be away from the bud to prevent the water running into the bud and causing rotting. So it's a good practice when you plant, or prior to planting, you go through and just prune the plant to the appropriate spot. Otherwise, what can happen, if it's got too much of a stub above the bud, the stub can die back and cause dieback in the bud itself and continue dying back down the main branches. You may have seen a rose where it's got all these dead sections in it, and that's generally because it's been pruned incorrectly, or hasn't been removed when it first starts. So always good practice to cut that out. It doesn't matter which way it faces, because this has been grafted or budded. They're normally budded. When the bud shoots, it tends to throw out 2 or 3 main branches. As this rose gets older, it will start throwing branches the other way, and then you can start pruning to suit the shape of the plant as need be. So most of the roses you see as a bare rooted plant at this time of the year are all one-sided, but that doesn't matter. You can still put the plant in, it will still grow and develop from that. This will put on a lot of growth in the springtime, and it won't be long before it has that traditional rose vase shape. The only thing I'd probably add at this time of the year, apart from say soil conditioners, are something like a root stimulant. Sea Sol, you probably know. There's a product called Plant Starter. They're good for helping the roots to settle in and getting the rose established. Obviously, it needs to be kept damp, It's not so critical at this time of the year because the soils don't tend to dry out as quickly, but a newly planted rose has to be kept damp. You need to water it well when you first plant it, and I'd probably water it in with either sea soil or plant starter, and then maintain the water as it needs it, particularly when it starts to produce new growth in the spring. The roots won't be fully developed at that stage, and if those roots dry out, then you'll start getting dieback on the top. Once they're well established, roses are pretty tough. They don't need a lot of water. Sometimes with a lot of new growth, when it first starts in the spring and a underdeveloped root system, the plant can be quite heavy and can move around a little bit in the wind. And sometimes you might need to stake a bush rose. I mean, it's always critical that you do it with a standard rose, but a bush rose may need some sort of stake just to support it until the roots are fully formed.
How long would you stake a standard rose for?
Standard rose would need staking probably for the rest of its days.
Okay, so you just have to stake.
Because what happens, it's top heavy.
Yeah.
You know, this, you can imagine that as a large plant, you know, even when the stem gets thicker, it's inclined to blow in the wind. You know, we get winds like we did 2 weeks ago. It's going to snap it. It just snap the rose off. So you get these lovely, nice roses, you know, well developed, and then you get heartbroken because the thing's been blown over in the wind. So with a climbing rose, when you plant it, it's probably better if this is, say, a wall or a fence you're planting against. The temptation is to plant the prongs on the wall like this way. It's actually better to plant it with those going away from the wall or the fence, because the new growth that's produced goes generally straight up in the air and it's easy to tie it back and fix it. So, I mean, it's not that critical, but it makes it easier later on if you do that. Climbing roses particularly, that new growth is really soft and more inclined to break. So you need to make sure as that's growing that you're tying it well, so you don't get any damage from them. It generally takes a climbing rose 2 years to flower from planting. Bush roses are not so bad. You'll generally get quite a few flowers in their first year, and the same with standard. A climbing rose tends to produce long growth, and they tend to flower better in their second year. Some people like spraying roses to protect them from disease. They're prone to, particularly in the warmer months, they're prone to black spot disease. You get all those black dots all over the leaves, and then the leaves go yellow and fall off. Some roses are worse than others, but you can start spraying in the winter time to help control that. There's a product called lime sulphur, which is a liquid sulphur spray you mix with water and then you spray it over the branches. When you do that, it kills off a lot of the black spot spores that are left on the leaves or on the branches from the previous year. So, and you might do that, say, a couple of times through the winter, and then you start spraying with a rose spray once the leaves come back on the plant, and that helps to protect it from black spot. There's another disease they get in the spring called mildew, where the leaves, powdery mildew, where the leaves get a white film on them. It makes all the leaves sort of go crinkly and don't look too good. They're prone to getting a few insects in the spring, like aphids. Aphids attack the new growth and the new flower buds, and any general sort of insecticide will kill aphids.
And do you use the same product?
You can get a rose spray that does both. Yeah. And the trick is with black spot, you've got to spray regularly. Make sure the rose is in an open, airy sort of situation. If you have a rose where it's poorly ventilated, then it's more inclined to get black spot and mildew. So, but you can get a spray that does both. Yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned the yellowing leaves. Is that a bug, or does that tend to be over water?
Sometimes it can be a number of things with roses. Sometimes what happens when they get black spot on the leaves, it starts off as a green leaf with black spots on it, and then over time the whole leaf goes yellow, and and then falls off. It's good practice to pick up those leaves when they do fall off because it helps to reduce the spread of it. So, but yellowing sometimes can because of prevailing weather. You know, if you get a really hot day and the plant's really stressed, then you can, that's right, you can get a bit of yellowing in the leaves as well. General yellowing all over is lack of food. But in most cases, the roses sort of bounce back. You know, I've seen roses where they've got no leaves left on them at all, and you give them, say, a summer prune, feed them, and away they go again. You get your growth. It's hard to kill a rose.